ensures that this structure remains tight. This regulatory capacity of the state is weakened in a large part of the developing economy through structural deregulations, systemic dismantling of the social security and buffer systems, and the retreat from a wider version of social policy and development outcomes. Eileen has already discussed about these things in terms of the neoliberalist policies that have been adopted in very many countries in the economy and how that led to the systemic dismantling of the state. The state in the developing world is therefore weakened both as a regulator in the market and in its role as a shock absorber or safeguard in containing social crisis and vulnerability of this economic crisis. The demand management policies, especially in terms of public investment and deficit financing, are therefore weakened in these regions. It is useful to reiterate that social policy instruments are not about public goods, public finance, at least not in the Samuelsonian sense, which is about where he talks about public good as collective consumption goods, where each individual's consumption of such goods leads to no subtraction from any other individual's consumption of that good. Rather, these public goods are social and economic commons because they involve the idea of a collective common good, not goods. Equity rather than non-excludability or non-rivalry is the determinant conditions for access. And access may be structured on the basis of gravity of need rather than presentation of demand. Transformative social policies relates not only to the transformation of an economy or protection from destitution, but to the transformation of social relations. This crisis kind of makes us aware of these facts once again. And I shall just conclude my discussion today by summarizing that I've argued that crisis is an inherent element of the global capitalist system, and usually welfare state intervenes to cushion the severity of economic and social impact of crisis and to mitigate the political ramifications of this crisis. That is to ensure order where there is potential of social disorder and to ensure status quo when the disorder poses a threat to the system. For the developing world, systemic weakening of the state through deregulation of the state apparatus itself increase the potential of violence of this economic crisis precisely because these two features are compromised. That's all that I have to talk to you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lopa. I'm afraid we'll have time for only one round of questions. So we open the floor. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'll ask a question to Anwar Sheikh before he runs. First. Okay, along the lines of the deeply confused about macroeconomics, that's very much my question. I got really confused about your graph on the difference between the interest rates and the profit rates. First, because I assume you're taking real interest rates, and so that's a graph of pretty much showing that the Fisher's arbitrage is completely wrong to start with. It's increasing. This gap is increasing over time. But what I'm puzzled about is because we had in our first session a discussion about why investment over GDP was so low in the past 20 years. So in that sense, although you had this gap, and apparently you were thinking that accumulation is driven by this gap, and this gap was greater and greater over time. In spite of that, we had a very low investment ratio, and I don't know, and growth seems to have been driven by something else, like consumption, which was, based on asset bubbles and so on. So, my question is how you would think about that. And the second question is is for Sanjay, on decoupling. I don't like this notion to start with, but it kind of make me nervous even to compare Brazil and China, Brazil and Mexico, and all these things. But anyway, Brazil and China, to start with, you have completely different, in one case, as you said, you have something that is, when they talk about decoupling in Brazil, they think about how great our orthodox economic policy was. That means inflation targets and high interest rates, and how we have managed to keep inflation low, and that's why we are decoupling. That's what these people are talking about. And
may I ask you to keep your question brief?
Let's stop.
So we just have a few minutes left, so let's take a couple of questions here.
Quick question for Anwar. If Paul Volcker and the Fed don't determine the interest rate, how is it determined? And for Eileen and Sanjay, I'd like to hear some talk about rebalancing the world economy, since the flows of capital into the U.S. Our current account deficit were a major part contributing to the crisis, and I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about how you view that going forward.
I'm going to turn it over to the panel. You can talk about things and about questions you might have after we end the panel, because we have to end at 6:15. Over to Anwar.
My apologies that I am running late already, so I did try to say a few things which obviously need clarification. Let me talk about why I use the profit rate minus the nominal interest rate. I would argue that that's correct, and here's the following reasoning for that. If you read someone like Sraffa, when you talk about a general profit rate, it is the current dollar value of the surplus product, which is applying current prices to the surplus product. So that's a nominal profit rate. That's how you pick it up from the net per accounts. But the denominator has to be then the current cost value of the capital stock, because it's in current prices. So both sets are in the same set of prices, and therefore they're inflation independent. Now, if you were to break that profit into two parts, which is profit, that's the gross profit, it's already nominal. You break it into a part which is the interest equivalent of that nominal gross profit, and that's a nominal interest rate, but times the capital stock in current prices, so it's already inflation adjusted. And that remainder is a profit of enterprise. You have to keep your dimensions straight, so to speak. So if you do it that way, what you get is gross profits minus the nominal interest rate times the current dollar capital stock, which is the interest equivalent on current dollar capital stock. And that leads to an interesting question. What is the meaning? That's the second question, is related directly to this. What's the theory of the interest rate that lies behind this? The idea that it is real interest rates it doesn't apply when you're taking the difference between the profit rate and the interest rate. One way to think of that is if your profit rate is not inflation adjusted, you subtract the rate of inflation from it. Then you subtract the real interest rate from it, the rate of inflation cancels out, because you're subtracting it twice from the unadjusted profit rate. But if you're doing the adjustment, you can't do it on one side only. And that leads me to the second point. What is my theory of the interest rate? My theory of the interest rate is not neoclassical theory. It's not determined by the marginal product of capital or anything like that, nor is it Keynesian. I would argue, and this is something I can only even briefly mention, that it's possible to develop a theory of the interest rate which says that it's determined in the long run in the same way as any other price by equalization of profit rates. Think of a bank. A bank is just a capital. Its output has a price, which is the interest rate. It has inputs, costs, and one of them is deposits and the costs of that. You can build a theory of the interest rate when you go from banking that way to the short-term interest rate depends on the costs of banking plus a normal profit rate. Ponico did this in a book some time ago. Then the medium interest rate is the short-term interest rate plus the cost of operating that plus a profit rate. This follows a schema that Hicks suggests in his theory of the interest rate. Has an interesting implication. One of the great puzzles about interest rates is, and this was discovered by Thomas Took, by the way, so it's not new, is the idea that the interest rate moves with the level of prices, not with the rate of inflation. If you follow Fisher and the idea of a real interest rate, then the interest rate minus the rate of inflation should be equal to the profit rate. So the real interest rate should be related. It's absolutely not true empirically. It's well known. What is known is that as prices rise, interest rates rise, and if prices fall, interest rates fall, leaving aside government intervention. And in my graph, I skipped over this part in one of my